pleasure to welcome you to this inaugural Dean's Lecture Series Symposium. We're going to be holding several of these through the academic year. As I think all of you are aware, we're in our new building, and so this is our first year to have a space like this in which we can hold a symposium. So it's not only special to me that this is our first Dean Symposium, but it's also special to me that we're hosting it here in our new building on Washington Circle. And it's also special to me that our speaker today is Jim Jones from the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Jim's career with EPA spans more than 26 years. President Obama nominated Jim Jones to be the Assistant Administrator for EPA's Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention in January 2012, and he was confirmed by the United States Senate in August 2013. Is that actually true, Jim? Mm-hmm. That's a long time to be for confirmation. Mm-hmm. He is responsible for managing the office, which implements the nation's pesticide, toxic chemical, and pollution prevention laws. This office has an annual budget of over $230 million and more than 1,200 employees. From December 2011 through July 2013, Jim served as the acting assistant administrator of the OCSPP. And between April and November 2011, he was deputy assistant administrator for EPA's Office of Air and Radiation. Prior to that, he had been deputy assistant administrator for the OCSPP and had actually had sent as acting assistant administrator. And before that, in 2003 through 2007, he directed the Office of Pesticide Programs. In that role, he was responsible for the regulation of pesticides in the United States with a budget of approximately $150 million and 850 employees, making it the largest EPA headquarters program office. Jim has an MA from the University of California at Santa Barbara and a BA from the University of Maryland, both in economics. But I said this was very special to me that Jim Jones was speaking. Many of you know that long time ago, a couple of decades ago, I was assistant administrator for this office, same office, although it had a different name at the time. But most of you don't know that at that time I worked very closely with Jim Jones, and even though it was close to the beginning of his career, he was obviously a rising star at the time, served as a special assistant in my office, and was just a wonderful colleague. And so it's with great pleasure, Jim, that I invite you to our podium today.
It's an honor to be here this afternoon with all of you. It was a period of time at the beginning of the Clinton administration when I worked for Dr. Goldman, and in many ways it was one of the highlights of my career. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is, because during that period of time from I guess it would be in the spring of 1993 at the beginning of that administration until I moved into a management job about 2 years later, we developed a food safety legislative proposal that ultimately got enacted into law called the Food Quality Protection Act. And you don't get too many opportunities like that in a government career. And Lynn was the leader of the organization, the job that I have today, during the development of that proposal. I then moved on to some managerial responsibilities in the pesticides program, and Lynn stayed on as the assistant administrator to see that legislative proposal become the law of the land. So it's really a great honor to be here today, Lynn, to address some of the students here in the School of Public Health. Unbelievably beautiful building that you have. Very appreciative of the LEED Platinum rating that you've got. I hope you all are as well. Very cool how we get to watch the storm unveil as we sit here. So I am gonna talk about. It'd be hard to talk in an hour about the scope of the office that I lead, so I'm going to try to spend some time on what I think are some of the particularly interesting public policy dimensions associated with this office. It's an office that has, I often say it's got a tale of two cities, although the analogy probably doesn't holds together really that well. One part of the operation, the pesticides program, has a very robust statutory framework within which we operate, not the least of which is the Food Quality Protection Act. And the other part, the part that governs, we often call them industrial chemicals, but in many ways they're commercial chemicals. They're chemicals in commerce that are not drugs, they're not pesticides, they're not cosmetics. Any other chemical falls within the toxics program, we refer to it. And the law that governs the toxics program, the law that governs commercial chemicals in the United States, has a very different legal framework that creates some particularly interesting challenges. And then we have an office that actually Lynn created, the Office of Science Coordination and Policy, that does basically just that. It coordinates science across the offices and works on the endocrine disrupting screening program, which is an important part of really both of our programs. So here are the statutes that govern pesticides and commercial or industrial chemicals in the United States. As I said, the Toxic Substances Control Act, commercial, industrial chemicals. The Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act is the basic licensing statute for pesticides in the U.S. Food Quality Protection Act, the one that I mentioned earlier, it governs amongst other things, but as it relates to pesticides, the legal limits allowable on pesticides on food, which is a big part of what we and people in general worry about with respect to pesticides. The FQPA actually amended the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which has a lot, basically the statute that governs food in the United States, much of which is implemented by the Food and Drug Administration. And then we also have responsibility for the Pollution Prevention Act, which is a statute that encourages EPA to find and implement voluntary means to reduce pollution at its source. It is not a regulatory program, but a voluntary one. I'm going to focus on pesticides and toxics here this afternoon. So TSCA, so it's a tale of two cities. TSCA is, again, the statute that governs commercial chemicals in the U.S. Most people probably think that chemicals that are sold in the U.S. have been evaluated for safety before they're able to be sold, and if they weren't evaluated before, they've been evaluated since they've been on the market. That's partially true. It's mostly not. About when TSCA was created in 1978, Congress and the society generally had this idea that these are chemicals, they're not designed to hurt anything, so they probably aren't hurting anything. So if you're already on the market, you must be okay. Well, we'll just put you on an inventory, and it's called the TSCA inventory. And so there are about 62,000 chemicals that are on the TSCA inventory that can be sold in the United States pretty much however you'd like to. Then, Congress said, but probably going forward, we probably want to have some kind of review of new chemicals. And so if a chemical was created post 1978, it has to come to EPA for some review. The law gives us 90 days to review it, and it does not require the manufacturer to do any health or safety data. They do have to come to us, and if we find that there's some reason to be concerned, we have authorities, actually pretty good and strong authorities, to regulate that chemical. If we don't have any reason to be concerned, then in 90 days it automatically can go on the TSCA inventory, and when you're on the TSCA inventory, you can use that chemical however you see fit. Interestingly, there's a lot of debate over whether or not the new chemicals provision of TSCA has been effective. We have over time come up with tools, usually involving structure activity, that have allowed us to pretty meaningfully evaluate chemicals even though they have not generated health and safety data for them. And the reason I feel like I can say that, now one can still debate whether or not it's robust enough, when we look at this universe, this total universe of over 80,000 chemicals, and we think about chemicals that have raised some concern in some form or other, often it's because research is being done often at universities, research is being done in the NGO community, research being done by the companies that make these chemicals around health and safety. The vast majority of the overwhelming majority of the problems that we have seen over the last 20 years involve the grandfathered in chemicals. Of the 22,000 compounds that we have had a chance to look at using the tools that we've developed, we have identified 2 where we feel like we missed the mark. One of them is actually a somewhat controversial flame retardant. One of the ingredients is in FireMaster 550, where our tool did not pick up that it was persistent and bioaccumulative, a flaw in the tools that we were using that we feel like we have corrected. And we didn't think we picked up the persistence, the bioaccumulation, or the reproductive effects associated with perfluoro compounds. 2 out of 22,000, not so bad. Tools that we were using seem to be reasonably good at predicting problems if there are going to be problems. That does not hold true for the compounds that were grandfathered in. Of the 62,000 or so that were grandfathered in, over 1,000, we've identified 1,200 of them, that express hazard in some way that raises a concern in our mind that we'd like to investigate further. So a large number, a relatively high percentage, it's small at one level but high in another. 2 out of 22,000 have raised problems of the newer chemicals. 1,200 out of 64,000 have raised issues of the older chemicals. And where the real challenge comes in is that the statute, TSCA, does not give us very good authorities to do anything about it. We are not required to look at these old chemicals. If we do it, it's because we think it's important, not because the statute creates a requirement on us, which is pretty important in government when you do not have mandatory duties. It makes it hard to get budget. It's impossible for anybody to sue you for failure to do a mandatory duty, which is often, unfortunately, how things get moving. Is you miss deadlines. Somebody sues you for missing a deadline. You get on the stick and you meet your requirements. But there's no duty on it. We have no duty to evaluate these chemicals. So that creates a little bit of inertia in the system. It's hard to argue for budget. It's just hard. It's to get the company who makes the chemical to generate health and safety data. We actually have to do a rulemaking, rather elaborate process. It's a multi-year process that can take upwards of 4 years. And that's just to require them to generate the health and safety data. And then once we get the health and safety, so say it takes you 4 years to write the rule, it takes them a couple of years to do the data. It takes you a couple of years to look at the data, a little while to do a risk assessment, and you're a decade down the road after you've identified maybe I'm worried here for some reason. And then the standard we have to meet for taking action is a pretty challenging one. It's not only a risk-benefit standard, it comes with some other bells and whistles. We lost a rather important case in the early 90s where we tried to ban and phase out asbestos, a known human carcinogen. It's unambiguous, nobody's arguing that. And that ban and phase out was overthrown because the court said basically we didn't do the analysis necessary, mostly related to how we analyze the alternatives. Not asbestos itself, but the alternatives. To ensure that we were finding the least burdensome way of regulating, and that we were confident that the alternatives weren't going to create riskier situations. So those factors have led this to be a pretty ineffective statute in many ways. I mean, we're pretty happy with the way new chemicals are evaluated. We think we're making sound decisions there, but we've got this huge number of existing chemicals that we feel very unsatisfied with our inability to date to be effective in ensuring their safety. And so at the beginning of the Obama administration, we articulated principles for reforming TSCA. They're right here. They're pretty common sense. They're pretty logical. In the TSCA reform debate, there actually is not a lot of a disagreement at the principles level. Chemicals should be reviewed against safety standards that are based on sound science and reflect risk-based criteria, protective of public health and the environment. The manufacturers should be providing EPA the data necessary to allow us to evaluate chemicals. So pretty straightforward, not hugely controversial, logical principles. But they're the principles that we're using as we engage Congress and the public in sort of in the debate about TSCA reform, which gets us to another fascinating. For anyone who's followed the TSCA reform debate, which I wouldn't be surprised if that includes just me and Dr. Goldman in this room, there's a lot of swirling around sort of, the areas of disagreement and the areas of disagreement and who's on first and who's on third. It fundamentally comes down to one issue, but it's a hugely important issue. And if I was in a government and politics class, you could go on and on and on about it. It's about preemption. When should the federal government preempt states' rights to act? That's what it all comes down to. So, we've got our principles out there. Industry's got their principles. The NGOs have their principles. We've seen legislation introduced by Senator Lautenberg, the late Senator Lautenberg, who actually introduced a bipartisan bill with Senator Vitter about a year and a half ago. If anyone has followed Senator Vitter's career, he's pretty conservative. And he's pretty anti-EPA. So it's kind of a big deal that he was willing to do anything that would give EPA more authority. So people thought that was a really big breakthrough, but there were a lot of problems with the bill that they introduced that were identified by the agency as well as the NGO community. Senator Lautenberg then died shortly after he introduced his bill, but Senator Udall from New Mexico, not the Udall who's running for Senate in Colorado right now. So Tom Udall in New Mexico began working with Senator Vitter, and they made a fair amount of progress bridging the gap between what a number of us identified as issues with the original Lautenberg-Vitter bill. And then right before Labor Day, they had shared their version with Senator Boxer, who chairs the Environment and Public Works Committee. And in Congress, the chair of a committee has an extraordinary amount of authority, and you really aren't going to get a bill unless the chair is on board. Right before Labor Day, Senator Boxer released a red line strikeout version of the previously unreleased Vitter-Udall bill. So we now know what Vitter and Udall had done, and we know what Senator Boxer thinks about it. And despite what you might read in the trade press around it, as I said earlier, it all comes down to preemption. At what level, if at all, should the federal government's decisions preempt states? Now, historically, in environmental legislation, the federal statute does not preempt states from acting. In our experience, the federal government having strong authority, in effect, leaves states feeling like they don't need to do anything because the federal government's working at it. But as a matter of fact, the federal statutes rarely actually preempt the states. So in the pesticides arena, a state can be more aggressive than EPA can be. They're restricted in how they can do it, but they can do it. It's unambiguous. The area where there's a little less preemption is in the establishment of the legal limit on food, and that is because food is sold in commerce, and so you wouldn't want the legal limit of chemical X to be 1 part per million in Maine, but 10 parts per million in Massachusetts. That would just be impractical. But as a matter of fact, a state could do that. They just have never done it. But the statute itself does not preempt a state from doing that. So in the toxic space, where, as I said, these are chemicals in commerce, so they're going to be sold across states, the industry, logically, would like there to be federal preemption. They'd like one decision to be made that governs the country, and they would then not have to worry about how to manage how they sell that chemical. They don't have to figure out, okay, I can make this furniture with these flame retardants, but I can only sell them in these 12 states, and for these other 14 states I have to have this kind of flame retardant, and for these I can't have it at all. So they would like just federal preemption. The public interest community is interested in no federal preemption whatsoever, so that they see as a guarantee if the federal government's not occupying the field as effectively as they think is appropriate, a state could step in and say, you know what, I know EPA, you said it was safe, but sorry, we're not going to allow you to use that chemical in this state. And that is the guts of the debate right now. Senator Boxer is from California. California has the most aggressive chemicals regulation program in the country. So is Senator Boxer going to be too interested in preemption? No, I don't think so. That seems pretty logical. Why would she? Her state is one that wants to be able to ensure that their views around chemical safety are preserved. So we'll see. We'll see going forward what's going to happen. Can a compromise be found in every other piece of federal? I've spent a fair amount of time not only at EPA but talking to former officials, including in the Food Quality Protection Act. Preemption is always a big deal. It's always a big deal. Almost always, if there's a will on both sides to sort something out, a compromise can be found. I think the unanswered question here is there a will on both sides to find some place that everybody feels is okay as it relates to preemption. I will say that if you look at the Senator Boxer markup of the Vitter-Udall bill, you will see that generally there's agreement that EPA should have a mandatory duty to evaluate existing chemicals, that we should be doing it against, this was actually a huge breakthrough, against a risk-based standard, not a risk-benefit standard, but a risk-based standard, that we should be able to take into consideration costs and other social benefits, but not have to balance them with risks, which is a pretty important consideration to be able to have, but not have to make this balancing. I'll say that as public health students, the reason why that's proven to be incredibly difficult is it is usually we do not have good tools to value the risks. It's often, we just can't do it. We can't figure out what the dollar value is of the risk we're calculating, yet we can always calculate the costs. So you end up what I call as a cost-biased standard. I mean, as an economist, I'm actually not opposed to the idea that there ought to be benefits for costs but it ought to be a level playing field. You ought to be able to accurately value them so you're making informed, balanced choices. But if you can't you can't quantify the economic value of your risks, it's very difficult to do cost-benefit balancing. That's a total policy view of mine. So I like sort of our principle that they ought to be, chemicals should be based on a risk-based standard, some health-based standards, but that the government ought to be able to take into consideration costs when it's making its determinations. Senator Boxer, as well as Senators Vitter and Udall, both include those characteristics in their drafts. There are little differences here and there along the way, and then you get to preemption, and it all just falls apart. Senator Boxer, no preemption. Senators Udall and Vitter, they have a fair amount, quite a bit actually, of federal preemption of state law. So that's where it hangs in the balance on. It's unfortunate that we have not been able to crack that nut. But I'm a pretty optimistic person. I am hopeful that we will over time. There's a fair amount of public interest in safer chemicals. There's greater awareness of chemicals and their influence in environment and public health. Those are the kinds of things that leads Congress to act. The fact that you have a rather conservative member of the United States Senate willing to give EPA more authority means he's hearing it from some parties. You have the chemical industry that is incentivized to do something about it. My view is because they feel the U.S. is falling so far behind Europe that when they're going to South America and to Asia, and they're stuck with those countries saying, we're going to go with the European system because the U.S. doesn't have a solid system. And the European system has a lot of hazard-based regulation as opposed to risk-based regulation, which industry really does not like. So I'm going to just spend a little bit of time, okay, well, what do you do every day, Jim, if you've got a lousy statute? And you just sort of sit around waiting for Godot and, twiddling your fingers? No, we don't. We've actually, and Dr. Goldman was instrumental in helping the agency figure out that just because you're dealing with a difficult statute doesn't mean you sit around and you do nothing all the time. You just have to be very creative. And although I do believe we have been very creative, I at the same time wouldn't stand up here or anywhere else and say, therefore, we're getting the job done. I think we are being very creative with a very difficult statute. And in many ways, I think once we do get a good statute, I think some of this creativity is going to pay dividends. I think it's actually paying dividends today. But I think it will really be powerful in a scenario where we have strong regulatory tools as well. So one of the things that we've been doing, and we can only do it because of some of the work that Ellen Goldman did when she was at EPA, which was she created a program called the High Production Volume Program, where companies were willing to voluntarily submit some basic health and safety data to EPA if they produced chemicals that were high production volume, over 1 million pounds per year. And actually companies went below that threshold in their willingness to generate the health and safety data. So we actually have a fair amount of health and safety data with chemicals in the United States, even though if we were to use our regulatory tools, it would have been very hard to have required the generate. So several thousand chemicals now have generated and submitted to us health and safety data. Others have generated health and safety data and provided it to us. We require the generation of some use data every 4 or 5 years that's been submitted to us. We have taken a number of regulatory actions over time. So one of the things that we can do that can help decision makers, and when I'm talking about decision makers here, although really everyone is a chemical decision maker, I'm really thinking of formulators, because they're the ones who are actually deciding what to put in a product that they're then going to sell to everybody. And they are making chemical decisions day in and day out, and they are doing it with a huge amount of uncertainty because of the scenario I've described. We don't have a great regulatory system in place. So how can we help them make informed choices when we're not actually regulating? And one of the ways is by giving them access to chemical data that we have. And so about a year ago, we launched a website, a portal that I hope people find who have used it is pretty user-friendly, pretty easy to search, allows searching by functional use, which is if you're a formulator, you're in there for functional use. You use a chemical for a surfactant, so you don't need to see everything. I might have a surfactant. I'm trying to replace this surfactant with another one. It would be useful to know what is known about it. You can go into ChemView and do searches like that. You can look for surfactants that have cancer data. You can look for surfactants that have reproductive or developmental data. You can string all of these things together in your search. Ultimately, if you're looking for a chemical that has been tested and is not toxic. So we have 8,700 chemicals that are in the portal, and many of them have basic toxicological data. Some of them have no data at all. Many of them have some level of assessment that's done by EPA, so you can see you don't actually have to review a rat study. You can see our review of a rat study. We have taken the data and actually put it into, which was a rather labor-intensive effort, into relatively easy summaries. So again, you're not looking at a 80-page document to find the bottom line. You can look at a rather short document that tells you here's the no-L, here's the low-L, here's the effect that was seen. So I think that this is a pretty powerful tool. I can certainly see it being used in a university setting. It hopefully is something that will give value to a lot of people who are interested in understanding what do we know about chemical health and safety. Very hard to read, but so this was a search that we did. I can't remember. I think this might have been. Yeah, I can't remember, sorry. But here you've got the chemicals that met the search criteria in this column. The next column over is data submitted to EPA. So if there is something in that, you can click on that and you can find out what the data is. You can actually then drill, you can literally look at a study, just keep drilling down. If we've done an assessment, the next column over, EPA assessments. If we've taken a regulatory action is the next column over. And then the last column is if you've reported how much you've sold as a company, it's going to be in that final column. So you have hazard, EPA assessments, EPA regulatory action, use. What do we know about it? how much is used of the chemical. Again, you can search by, you can put the chemical name you want in it. You can put a functional class in it. You can put a functional class with certain characteristics, and in that way find out what do we know about certain compounds. Again, my dream in this is that formulators are using this to make informed choices about product substitution. So if they're trying to get out of a carcinogen, a reproductive toxicant, a developmental toxicant, a persistent and bioaccumulative chemical, they can do some searching by functional class, figure out what we know. They then have to figure out, though, well, they say it's functional class, but is it going to meet my performance needs? That would be on them, but they know how to do that. This is the kind of stuff that we can help them do it in a very informed way around what we have knowledge around. So it's kind of an exciting tool that we've done. And sometimes you can make a big difference in a way that doesn't cost a huge amount of money. This cost low 7 figures, not 8 figures, low 7 figures, to be able to launch something along these lines. The other thing that we're doing, which is consumer facing, that I think has a huge amount of power to it, that was launched during Lynn's era at EPA, and we're just doing a minor tweak to it. So in the 90s, there we are. We've just lost this asbestos case. We have a very ineffective statute. We want to do things that use what authorities we have to help move public health protection, environmental protection along with these limitations. And so Lynn starts the high production volume challenge, get people to generate health and safety data. And the other innovation was, what if we come up with a safer labeling program so we can tell consumers that this product has chemicals that have been evaluated and they're safer? That's a good idea. So we established criteria, and it's hazard-based criteria, which is creating a bit of a stir right now, and quite robust. And there's not been a lot of pushback over the last 15 years, which is how long this has been in place, over the criteria that we have. There seems to be general acceptance, which is hard to do. The NGOs are often like, make it more stringent, make it more stringent. The industry, make it less stringent. We don't get a lot of that. Parts of the industry are saying make it risk, not hazard. We are resisting that, and I can talk about that in a minute. And over time, we get 2,500 products are now eligible and have the label. And I should have brought a copy of the existing label. 25. I mean, this is not obviously impossible to meet. If 2,500 different products can meet the standard, there are 2,500 products in the program right now. Most of the activity is in the institutional space, and it's because we have, over time, through federal purchasing requirements that have then been adopted at the state and the municipal level, there is purchasing preference given to DFE labeled products. And so which has been very influential in building the program out. That's why we have as many products as we've got right now. But most people, like you guys, you're probably not familiar with this. How many people know about Energy Star? Who knows about the Design for the Environment Safer Labeling Program?
We use it here.
Excellent, awesome. It just does not penetrated the way that DFE is, or that Energy Star has. So, well, maybe all we really need to do is just change the logo. I mean, the program itself obviously is, people are agreeing on the criteria that we're using. We've clearly been able to qualify products for it. Maybe it's just the logo. So we're going through a process right now. I really wish I'd thought to show you what the existing logo looks like. It's basically, well, let's start with the name, Design for the Environment. So we did some consumer testing, and what do you think we found in that? It doesn't tell you it's safer product. It tells you it's probably good for the environment. When you ask people why, they come up with all different reasons why. But what they never say is that it's the ingredients in the product are safer. So the name itself, which, those of us who have been around a while, we can't stop saying it. And I can't stop saying it. DFE, it's everywhere. The Safer Labeling Program, the name does not convey the message. And then there's actually the logo itself, other than the name, which has a globe. Seems pretty good, like Mother Earth, good thing, feel good. But we've redesigned a logo. We put this out about a month ago for public comment. But in the development of these alternative logos, instead of what we originally did, which was a bunch of people like me and Lynn and others working in the government do logo design, which is really not what we've been trained. Have you guys spent any time on logo design here in the School of Public Health? It's really not what we do. But there are people who actually go to school and get jobs, and some of them seem to make a lot of money doing this. And so we hired some people to help us figure out, if we're trying to convey a message of safer chemicals, what would that logo look like? And so they gave us some design options. We then took the design options to the existing partners. So we've got like 600 companies selling these 2,500. So we didn't want to completely upset that apple cart because they were partners. So we took it to the existing partners, got their feedback. They were basically comfortable, and we were a little nervous. We weren't sure that chemical companies would want safer choice or safer anything on their product, and they were okay with it. And those who don't have it aren't so pleased. But so they were okay. They made some interesting observations about how we can make it better. We then went to a broader group of stakeholders, but they're people who play in our space all the time. Got their feedback, and then in September we put this out on our web. You can go to EPA's website and you can find this. And it basically asks you, everybody, what do you think? And so we're getting just broad public comment. The last thing we're going to do, maybe one of the most important things we're going to do, is we're going to go to focus groups. So you guys will all be excluded. You know way too much. We're going to go to people who, they're consumers. They're just consumers. The same people that a consumer products company would take when they're trying to figure out how to position a product in the market. And what we want to find out is, do one of these labels or any of these labels mean what we think it means, what we want it to mean? We know what it thinks. What we want it to mean. We've already got a fair amount of testing that consumers desire this. So the idea that they could determine easily that the ingredients in a product are safer, they've told us they want that. And they've also told us, interestingly, they want meets EPA criteria. They want EPA criteria. We actually thought about, you know what, the private sector can just do this. And the private sector does do this. There are some groups out there. And what we heard repeatedly from both the company partners and from consumers is that they wanted the credibility of the US government's evaluation. So we know those things, but now we want to sort of make sure that it is interpreted the way we're trying to convey a message. So we'll do that in the next couple of months, and then in the spring we're going to launch one of these. So what do you guys think? Which one do you prefer? Who likes A? Got some A's. Ooh, a large number of A's. Who likes A? Start. Get our A's. All right. How about B? A and B get some. Okay. C and D. That's interesting. That pattern is repeated every time I ask the question, which is the general preference for A and B, often very evenly divided between the two. So we'll see. One of these will launch in the spring, and you can tell everybody, yeah, you heard about this. So this is another way, in the absence of really strong regulatory authority, we feel like we can move the space, chemical space, to a safer place where chemicals that people are exposed to are safer for human health and the environment. And again, this is done with a nickel, really. I mean, it's not literally, but it did not cost us a lot of money to do this work, largely because we were building on a chassis that was pretty solid. But even that was not hugely expensive for us to do. So I'm going to segue to the other part of the portfolio, which are pesticides. Pesticides are tough. Let me tell you, they're although the statute's really robust. We've got a very robust regulatory framework in the United States for pesticides, and it's got two elements to it, but it's just a very challenging space. I like to say that my observation as someone who's been in this space for a long time is that Americans, and I think probably worldwide, have a love-hate relationship with pesticides. As a general matter, we hate them. We hate the idea of them. If you ask people their general reaction, bad, go away, keep them out, until they see a pest. And then they want them dead, and they want them dead now. And I don't care whether it's a cockroach. My wife is hilarious. She's going to buy organic all the time. And inevitably, it's almost like the pests know what I do for a living. We're going to Jones's house. We've had termites. She's like, I want them dead, and I want them dead now. And I'm like, no, actually, the termites aren't going to do damage for a couple of years. Now. I want them dead. She's vacuuming them. Well, at least that's IPM. That's okay. And I don't think she's unusual at all. If you see a pest, you do not want bed bugs. I'm here to tell you, you don't want bed bugs. You want them dead. That's what you want with a bed bug. Even ants, which are fundamentally innocuous, people don't like ants. I'm like, come on, some of these guys are really not that bad at all. We don't want our food consumed by pests. We really don't. Some people may be willing to tolerate some blemishes, but we certainly don't want them like just destroyed. We like cheap food too. So it's got this love-hate relationship, which makes, as a public policy official, a very difficult place to be almost all of the time. Today included, where we licensed a chemical that's been used in the United States for 50 years. We've reassessed it multiple times, but we added a new use to it today that's bad things will be said about me in the newspaper when you read it tomorrow. 2,4-D on genetically modified corn and soybeans. So the strengths of so FIFRA licenses the pesticide. So you cannot sell a pesticide in the United States unless we license it. It's like a drug. You cannot sell a pesticide unless it's licensed by our organization. So which gives us quite a bit of control. The problem with the licensing statute is that, and we've done some rather creative workarounds of this. Once we want you to when your license taken away, the company can game it for quite a long time. And we actually had a recent example of that. We figured this out 20 years ago, and we began negotiating outcomes because we found we could get negotiated outcomes much more quickly than using the regulatory process. And then a company says, you know what, I'm not playing the negotiation game. And it was a public health issue, rodenticides, which in the United States, a rodenticide, they kill people don't like rats either. In case you didn't know that. They're a public health problem too. Mice, they're a little more tolerant of, but they don't like them so much either in their house. So rodenticide, the products that can kill rats and mice, they are basically anticoagulants, the same chemicals that are used as drugs, and the rodent bleeds out. It's ugly, it's messy. And that's how they die. And they're overdosed with the anticoagulant. They were licensed in a way that actually would allow you to sell them in loose pellets in a little jar that you could put on the floor. And well, what do you think was happening? Things on the floor, they're colorful. Who's on the floor a lot? Kids, dogs. 10,000 exposures a year, and all with kids. And although very few actually medical emergencies associated with it, would happen every once in a while where somebody actually needed to get treated with vitamin K is the way you would treat it. But the social costs of 10,000 poison control center calls, trips to the emergency, they're not trivial. And no parent should have to go through it. The kids shouldn't have to go through it. And like the idea that we're going to educate everybody, don't worry about it, that's not very practical or appropriate. So we told the manufacturer, you got to get it out of the pellet and you got to put it in child-resistant packaging. And the three of the big companies says, fine, salutes. They changed their license. They didn't sell it that way anymore. One company, the biggest one, by the way, said, no, we're not going to do it. And it had been like 20 years since somebody flipped us the bird on this, and we were like, whoa. So we get the machinery going, and it literally 5 years into it, they had dragged it out, and then this past spring, they threw in the towel and complied with the requirements. So we are a little bit limited if a company decides they're going to fight our desire to change their license. Now we've regulated chemicals on the market, already on the market, hundreds of them in the last 20 years. And we've had two companies take us through the regulatory machinery. One, FIFRA, and FIFRA actually was the one that provides the really long process. The other one, we sort of backed them into an FFDCA regulatory process for this very reason, and that's a much quicker one. So FFDCA is the other statute that governs pesticides. So every pesticide has to be licensed. But if the pesticide is used on food, it has to meet the requirements of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which has a risk-only standard, reasonable certainty of no harm. That was the work of Dr. Goldman in the Food Quality Protection Act, which is a pretty robust standard. I mean, right? Risk only, reasonable certainty of no harm. No benefits consideration allowed whatsoever. And it has a more streamlined process if we determine that that we need to revoke and the term we use in the United States is tolerance, the legal limit of a pesticide residue on food. Much quicker than the FIFRA process. So if you've got a product that is used on food, I would advise you, and you have a problem with it, to challenge them under FFDCA. You can get a quicker result than under FIFRA, even though that pesticide both is licensed under FIFRA and has a legal limit established under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So you've got this robust regulatory process. Everything coming in the door has to be reviewed by EPA. If it's non-food use, it's a risk-benefit balancing. If the chemical is used on food, it's a risk-only standard of reasonable certainty of no harm. We are required by the statute to aggregate all sources of exposure. So I'll loop back to that in a second. And we're required, if we find a common mechanism of toxicity, we're required to add those as well. And every 15 years, we got to go back and look at everything again. So there's this constant review cycle going on for pesticides. So the FFDCA risk-only standard, risk-only standards are challenging. They can really be tough. You can find yourself in a pickle. And when the law passed, I think we were expecting to find ourselves in a couple of pickles, which interestingly only happened once. So there are 10,000 food use tolerances in the United States. And we were given 10 years to evaluate all of them against this standard, and we did it, which is kind of remarkable. It doesn't meet those kind of mandatory duties on time very often. As a matter of fact, it's the only one I'm aware of. But because pesticides, nobody gives us any credit for it. One of those 10,000, one, put us in the pickle that we were like, oh, geez, I wish I didn't have to do that. And it was fluoride. Because fluoride is a pesticide. Most pesticides are just pesticides. Some pesticides are other things. Fluoride is a pesticide. It's an alternative to methyl bromide, which is a dangerous pesticide that destroys the ozone layer. So we're trying to get rid of methyl bromide, and fluoride was the alternative. Well, we had to aggregate all of the exposures of fluoride. Was fluoride? Oh, hell, it's in water. It's naturally occurring. And when you add all those in, you couldn't meet the reasonable certainty of no harm finding, even though the pesticidal use had very little exposure, very little risk, and societally, we thought it was more important for the pesticide use to exist than some of the other ones, which are in your drinking. You can get it in bottled water, you can get it in toothpaste. And, but the statute creates this bar. Ultimately, Congress a year ago intervened and gave fluoride an exception to the standard, the only one of the 10,000 tolerances that created that kind of public policy challenge where you felt like this isn't really the right place to land on this one, which is kind of remarkable. I'd heard that you might want to hear a little bit about international harmonization. I'm only going to spend 1 second on this. This we spent a fair amount of time on this, and it's because both of the groups of chemicals that I have been talking about, commercial chemicals and pesticides, they are commodities and they are traded. And so there's a lot of desire by the governments and often the industry to harmonize so that you don't have completely different requirements in Europe than you have in the United States, different in Asia than you have in the United States. And so we do spend a fair amount of time on international harmonization. Underlying all of our efforts is that we're not going to lower standards just to get a harmonized outcome. But it's amazing how much progress you can make when countries actually start from the ground, how different they can be, and how close you can get them without having to compromise your overall protection goals. So we spend a fair amount of time on that, as it's pretty important for the ability to trade food, for example, which we, as a general matter, like to do. So. With that, I'm going to wrap it up. I'd be happy to take any questions. I realize this is a sort of a policy kind of conversation, not a classic public health lecture, because I'd be unqualified to give a public health lecture. But I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Hi, I'm Chelsea. I have a question on the DSC. As a consumer, I'm just curious, what are the exact criteria and what is considered safer choice exactly?
Okay, so you can have no carcinogen reproductive toxicant, developmental toxicant, CMRs. Can't be persistent. It can't be bioaccumulative. And then we have rather high thresholds in terms of NOELs related for chronic effects. Basically, there's no hazard to the chemical. Yep. Yes, sir.
What interaction does the EPA have with certain expert non-government organizations like the American Chemical Society, FASA, AAAS, and so on and so forth? And the second question is, do you have something like the FDA has a post-approval review and possibly even a cancellation?
Yeah, we have, as I mentioned, in pesticides, there's every 15 year, we've completed one post-approval review for every pesticide. They've all been through a post-approval review. And right now, they're all going through their second one, which we're sort of just about heading into the guts of that. We have a lot of relationships with external organizations, as you described. The ACS, we're actually tomorrow hosting a Green Chemistry Awards program where we spend a lot of time on green chemistry with the ACS. We also have our own statutorily mandated peer review, which is not an external organization per se. They actually are housed with us. But so almost all of the controversial science decisions that we make, we take them to this, it's called the Scientific Advisory Panel, as opposed to the Scientific Advisory Board, which gives the rest of EPA science advice. We have a lot of relations. We're actually from weed scientists to the ecological. What's the name of the ecological group that does?
I know. I can't. It's on the tip of my tongue.
But we're
Scientific toxicology.
CTAC, right? CTAC. That's it. We're very active with CTAC. We're active with the Society of Toxicologists. We have a lot of those kind of professional relationships that we encourage our staff and management to engage in. There's a question back there. Yep.
I have a question about ChemView. Is there an overlap between ChemView and IRIS? Do either of them inform one another?
So if a chemical, so ChemView is information that we have about a chemical. So if a chemical has an IRIS assessment, it would be in the column that says EPA assessment. So any IRIS assessment is linked in TRI. So TRI is another part of EPA, the Toxics Release Inventory. If there's TRI reporting on a chemical, that would be in that last column of use or exposure data. So we link in with some other parts of EPA into ChemView.
Is there any chance that ChemView information would help inform an IRIS assessment, or no?
Yeah, I mean, if they're working on an IRIS assessment, chances are ORD, which does IRIS, already knows about it. But absolutely, it could, yeah. But more often than not, they're going to know about the existence of that data already. Yeah.
Yeah, a very good talk, and thank you for dealing in a very difficult, controversial type of area. I guess the question I have is not much of a softball here, but relative to, I know when we do toxicology, we're looking at liver damage, kidney damage, cancer. How confident are you, would you say, in our ability to vet things like autism and Alzheimer's, and things that are diseases that might be difficult?
Yeah. One of the things that we're trying to get our arms around now is there's more and more epidemiological data that we have struggled to figure out how to interpret in the animal model world. We do include it, and so when we're doing an assessment on a chemical, we're going to include all of that information, but I don't think we have mastered how to include it. And so I think that is an area that we need to figure out how to be better at interpreting some of the information that is being developed right now. Autism, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. Yes?
Are there public health jobs at EPA, and how would you advise students, public health, who might be interested in learning more about the opportunities there?
There absolutely are public health jobs. We hire a fair number of people with the kinds of backgrounds that you all, as a matter of fact, it's a very valued background that you have, that you're developing. And So it is a place that if this kind of work is interesting to you, you should seriously think about career at EPA. It's an incredibly interesting, exciting place to work. I would say that the most direct but the hardest thing to do is keep an eye on USA Jobs, which all of our jobs are posted on USA Jobs. The other thing to do would be to just sooner contact somebody who works at EPA. You've got a couple of them in your class right now, just to help you have your ear to the ground. Let me know. Let Dr. Goldman know. Networking like that. But USA Jobs is where we are going to advertise every job. We don't do anything other than that in terms of hiring. Yeah.
I just have one more question, sir. Regarding the campaign, I understand that it's supposed to inform the public of certain pesticides and chemicals, but how do we distribute this information so people are actually aware that this is out there for them? Because this is the first I've ever heard of campaign.
Yeah.
And being in a university setting, that's actually pretty easy to find information like that, but in the general public, that would be quite difficult. How do we go about distributing this information?
That is a great question. I will say it's one of the hardest things that, and I think we're reasonably self-critical about it. At the agency, we feel like we really are struggling to get our message out, but we're aware that we are struggling to get our message out. And so insights you have about how we can get our message out are very valuable. We spend a lot of time, and we've been trying to be more savvy with social media. It's a really challenging environment to get one's message out. But I'm all ears on that.
I mean, just an idea, but EPA has a wealth of information that is on its websites that, like ChemView, that the public doesn't know about. One thing that I've noticed, so does the National Weather Service, right? But then people have created applications to make it really easy to access it. No one goes onto the National Weather Service website to get information except me. I do it. But most people, use an app.
Right. AccuWeather.
Or go to weather.com or something. And, that's something that all of you could do. You could create apps or work with people who know how to create apps. Not necessarily to recreate that information, but to make that information more user-friendly to the public.
It's a great idea. And we could be thinking about doing that as well. I think it's a great idea. I think it's something we really, really struggle with. Yeah.
I have a completely ground level public health question.
Yep.
I'm a former aviation maintenance chief in the military, and there's this feeling, and at least for the people at my level, mechanics and such, that the more hazardous it is, the more effective it is.
Sometimes that's true.
I remember in the 80s, the best stuff we had was called green death and red lead. They're amazing corrosion prevention materials. And, I remember when the advent of, or I don't know if it's the advent, but when MSDS was showing, material safety data sheets, and we just wanted to totally hide those.
Right.
Because it cost time. And we couldn't use stuff anymore that worked. But my question is, just for the general public in the civilian world, when you go into like an ADAP or an auto repair store or whatever, there's no little signs, that say, it's probably on the label really tiny.
Yeah. Impossible to read.
Or a dust mask, and nobody even knows the difference between those two. Is there any statute or hope of maybe some type of
this is an awesome question. I almost feel like I planted you there. So we are trying to do sort of classic assessment of some chemicals, like we did with asbestos, which we stopped doing 25 years ago, and two of them, and we put final assessments out for NMP and methylene chloride as paint strippers, and they're bad, they're dangerous, and our assessment says so. And what people will need to use if we were to take them up, which we may well get them both off the market as paint strippers. We have not decided, but it's completely on the table, is you will need to use more elbow grease getting paint stripped. They're very effective. Now that's not always the case, but for those two, that's the case. Another one is TCE is a very good engine cleaner. It's dangerous, though, for the person using it and the people around them. There are, however, plenty of other solvents that don't require you to work harder than TCE as an engine cleaner. But that we are looking at some of the compounds exactly like you're describing that have been used in these. We're looking at the ones not just with an industrial use, but they have this nexus of the home repair person is just like the person in the auto body shop or the small plant, and they would use it the same way, and they would basically face the same risks. Yeah. So we're actually going to see if we can use the old creaky TSCA to deal with them. But they might end up with labeling. It's not, like I said, we have not decided, but they might just be banned.
One last question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for your information. I'm wondering about, in the range of chemicals assessed, are chemicals used for farming crops and for livestock, poultry, and by big industry like mining and petroleum, are they covered within this assessment?
So the crop chemicals basically are pesticides, and they are some of the most controversial, but they are all assessed and they are reassessed. The chemicals that would be used in mining, more or less, would be TSCA chemicals. Those are the chemicals that we've had a much harder time actually doing assessments for, but we're beginning to do that.
And for like the timber industry, forestry?
If it's to control pests, they would be pesticides. And most of them in the timber industry would be to control pests, I would expect.
Preservatives.
And preservatives are,
Petroleum industry?
they would be industrial chemicals governed by TSCA. Yep.
All right, well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.